Hi guys, Molton here and welcome back to another opening repertoire video. Today we'll be taking a look at the Milner Barry Gambit, or specifically the modern way of playing the Milner Barry. It's one of the best gambit options against the French defense, and it's perfect for those of you who are quite aggressive or want to put your opponent under pressure early on, or just want to have a little bit of fun against the French. Stick around to the end of the video and I'll walk you through all the key variations and everything you need to know to make it a complete working repertoire. Like, comment below if you find the video useful, otherwise we'll jump straight in. Okay, so this gambit starts out after 1e4, e6, white plays d4, d5, and then we advance our pawn to the e5 square. Black counters in the center with the move pawn to c5, a typical move in the French. We play the move pawn to c3, getting into the advanced variation. And now black has a couple of options to deviate before playing the move knight to c6. So we'll take a look at those first. The first deviation is the move bishop to d7. And the idea of bishop to d7 is that black wants to keep the knight back and trade off one of his worst pieces, which is this light squared bishop. After the move knight to f3, queen to b6, for the purposes of our repertoire, it's probably better that we play the move bishop to d3 in this position, although bishop to e2 is also perfectly fine. But because we're playing this gambit, I'm just going to recommend the move bishop to d3. And for example, after the move bishop to b5, the main idea here for white is that we take here on c5. And after bishop takes c5, we're going to follow through with the move pawn to b4. And this has been played by even Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces on a number of occasions with great results. The idea is that black is unable to capture here on f2 because after the move king to e2, we would eventually win this bishop on f2 with the move rook to f1, and it's trapped. Therefore, black has to retreat the bishop to, let's say, e7 or f8, after which we follow through with the move bishop to e3, and after queen a6. Here Magnus on both occasions he played the move bishop takes bishop, queen takes, and pawn to a4, which is perfectly fine, but I believe that the move bishop to c2 is a slight improvement on this. The idea is that we want to keep this bishop on b5, which at the moment is stopping our king from castling, but it doesn't actually have too many good squares to go to, because after the move pawn to a4, it's going to be quite short on squares. And on c4, it can easily be attacked by our knight going to a3, as we'll see. So for example, let's say knight h6, we could follow through with bishop takes h6. And after pawn takes, we can go with a4, bishop to c4, knight to a3, hitting this bishop. Let's say black plays the move knight to d7, we could follow through with queen to d4, and let's say rook to g8, we can simply play g3 to block out the rook. And if black tries to castle, well, now we can capture the bishop. An endgame would be quite bad for black to trade into here, so he should keep the queens on probably. But after, let's say, queen f4, we can see white has a really clear advantage here. We're just castle and our king is perfectly safe. Likewise, if instead of bishop e7 on move 8, black tried bishop f8, again we can play bishop e3, queen a6, and we can take the bishop like I said, but I quite like the move bishop to c2 again, with knight e7 being met by a4, bishop c4, and again this knight to a3 move, and I quite like white's chances. If instead black goes for bishop takes d3, which is probably the best move in this position for black, after which we can go queen takes, bishop f8, castles. So black has managed to get rid of his worst piece, which was the light squared bishop, but he still has some other problems, like his king is underdeveloped, and it's unclear that he really wants to go queenside because the king will be quite open there. So a number of ways the game could continue from here. So for example, most people play knight c6. I want to show you a nice trap in this position that could take place after the move knight to e7, and after knight to a3 if black plays the move a6, rook d1, and blunders here with knight to d7, then you have a very strong move here. You have the move knight to c4, which happened in one particular game, and white is completely winning now because of the threat of the queen as well as knight d6. You can't take because of this mate. But most people will play the move knight to c6, after which you can play knight a3 here as well, which is perfectly okay. I suggest probably rook e1, and for example knight to e7, we can play the move pawn to a4, knight g6, and you'll see this idea crop up a lot, but I will be suggesting whenever the knight goes to g6 that we want to hit it out with the move pawn to h4, which is a typical motif in this particular line. We want to chase this knight away to really stop black from finishing his development easily. For example, queen c7 could be met by queen e2, and here if black plays h5, then he has to deal with the fact that there's always this weak pawn on h5 for the rest of the game. And we can just continue with, let's say, knight a3, bishop to d2, and a quiet move like g3 to defend h4, and it's clear that white has a very, very comfortable position here. So instead of bishop to d7, the main line is knight to c6. So after knight to c6, we play the move knight to f3, queen to b6 is the main move, but some people have also tried this move knight to e7. After this, I suggest two ways of playing. One is knight to a3, which is a very good alternative and probably one of the best moves in this position, but because of this repertoire, I would suggest bishop d3 just to keep things in a similar fashion. And after pawn takes, you can actually just still sacrifice the pawn here. So you can play pawn takes, and after knight f5, knight c3, I just gambit the pawn with knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, castles, knight to c6, and just follow through with rook to e1. And this has also been played by a few strong players, including Fedoshev. For example, in this position, if black plays bishop e7, we follow through with the move queen g4, a typical idea, and we have sort of compensation for our sacrificed pawn in the form of some kingside attacking ideas as well as some dark square pressure. Likewise, if black plays the move pawn to a6, we can play the move queen g4 again, sort of stopping black from developing his kingside bishop without playing a move like g6, which would seriously weaken his position. And then we can play on the dark squares from here with decent compensation. So instead, most people play queen b6. Now the old way of playing the Milner Barry was to play bishop to d3. And after pawn takes, we play the move c takes. Now there was this old trap here which goes knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and here you can win the queen with the move bishop to b5 check. So this is the old way of playing it, but people would just play bishop to d7 to stop it. After castles, knight takes d4. Here if you go knight takes d4, queen takes d4, knight c3. If black takes the pawn, he runs into a lot of trouble, of course, but he could just play a6 and it's perfectly okay for black. White has also tried other moves like knight d2 here on move 9, which is another option, but again, I think this is totally fine for black, and I give a remedy in my video on the French. So instead of all this, I think a much better option on move 7 is this move castles. So after the move castles, the idea is very, very interesting. White just sacrifices this pawn for extra development, and also our main idea is to stop black from finishing his development on the king side by disrupting it with some moves, as you'll see. So for example, bishop to d7, so we just ignore the pawn on d4, we're not taking it, so we play the move rook to e1. Now we want white to capture, so if white captures, then we'll capture back with the knight and we get that extra lead in development. And then we play this key move, pawn to h4, so that whenever you see a knight go to e7, you'll see this pawn to h4 move crop up like all the time. The idea being that white is stopping knight g6 with a threat of pawn to h5, chasing this knight away. And knight to f5 is always met by bishop takes f5. So instead of taking on c3, black can try some other options here, like knight h6, knight e7, or some other waiting moves. If knight h6, the easiest solution is probably just to play some waiting moves ourselves. This h3 move is quite useful just to stop the knight from hopping into the g4 square, and then we can continue to play some useful waiting moves such as a3 and perhaps even b4, which is a common theme in a lot of these positions, just waiting for black to make clear what he's doing with this knight on h6. So this is a good response. After the move knight to e7, which is the main response for black in this position, we show our idea again, which is the main move in this position, which is pawn to h4, and a move you should definitely remember. The idea again is to prevent the knight from going to g6 because we're threatening h5. Now black has to find some useful waiting moves in order to complete his development. So one move here is the move knight to f5, which has been played by no other than strong Polish player Duda with the black pieces. But here I love Shevchenko's treatment with the white side, and I definitely recommend it. First we take the knight, pawn takes, we take here. Now in this position we can see that with the pawn on h4 we stop many of black's threats with g5, but we need to hold this from taking place, otherwise when we reroute our knight to f4 it's going to be kicked away. So I like how white plays this. He plays the move rook to e3, and after bishop to e7 reroutes the knight, and then plays the move pawn to h5 to secure the square on f4 when the knight gets there. Black has the two bishops, but we can see this light squared bishop is not doing anything in this position. Here white played the move knight to e1, again rerouting the squares on g3 for the rook. The knight goes to the d3 square instead, and here that knight goes instead to the f4 square, and the rook goes to g3. We had an exchange, but we can clearly see that white's bishop is definitely much better than the bishop on e6, and in fact white missed a nice opportunity a bit later on in the game. So the knight ended up on c5, and in this position here white played the move king h2 but missed a great opportunity to perhaps win the game with a rook sacrifice on g7, and then bishop takes h6, followed by either queen g5 or knight e6 is strong with a lot of play for white. For example, rook g8, queen takes, and white has tremendous counterplay here. So knight f5 is okay for white. Instead, let's have a look at rook to c8, which is another popular option. After the move rook to c8, I probably suggest pawn to h5, just to keep the knight away from g6. Pawn to h6, and again we're finding some useful waiting moves. Here we sort of don't have too many left, therefore white often plays the move knight to d2 and just allows black to capture. Usually black will capture here in order to take away this square in the future from our pieces. And there are lots of lines here you could have a look at and play into. For example, one interesting one is rook to b1, and after queen to c7, bishop to a3. Here we get a nice queen sacrifice line that takes place after queen takes c3, and white's idea is to play knight to b3. Now if black plays the move knight e to c6, which is actually a playable move, white can play the move rook to c1, which seemingly traps the queen, but black is getting a couple of pieces in return, so it's not that clear. After queen takes e1, queen takes e1, one variation might go bishop takes, and here I reckon knight takes a5, and we get a very interesting position here after knight takes b7. Bishop goes back. You could play queen e3 or queen c3 with some unclear play to follow. It's probably dynamically equal here. If knight takes b3, then I think white's idea is to go rook takes b3 followed by queen to b1. And in this one particular game, black was in a lot of trouble already. After bishop to d6 and pawn to a4, white had a lot of pressure on the queen side and went on to win a nice game. So after h4, one of the main moves here for black is actually to play this h6. And after h6, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, a very strong French player in this position who tried it out with the white side, came up with this move pawn to a3. You could also play h5, which would sometimes also transpose to other variations, but yeah, a3 is a nice move here. The idea being we meet black's next move with the move pawn to b4, and eventually we develop our bishop to b2, and we threaten to take the pawn back on d4, essentially forcing black to capture on c3, and eventually our knight will develop out to c3 square, and our pieces are quite harmonious, and we have sort of the typical compensation in Milner Barry gambits. So I hope you enjoyed this look into the Milner Barry and enjoy trying out these lines. It's a lot of fun to play, and it's a great option for those of you looking for something aggressive against the French defense. So like, comment, subscribe below again if you found it useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.